Hi, my name is Dean Smith. I'm the director of Duke University Press, and thank you all so much for being here. And we're going to talk about ebooks. We did a session last year, and Arielle, Rob, and Mike are like family now. We see each other a few times a year. We've got articles or chapters coming out in a Charleston publication, and we'll be happy to come next year if you want us to, because there's so much that changes in this space, and I just like hearing what Michael has to say about the market all the time anyway. So, and I drew the short straw, so I'm going first, and I'll talk to you a little bit about Duke University Press and some of the things we're doing with our ebooks. And you can go again there. Thanks, Arielle. So what do? We publish high quality peer-reviewed books in the humanities and social sciences. We're a little bit different than a lot of university presses. We really tend to publish and center marginalized voices. We center queer, decolonial, global, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color perspectives. That's something that we're known for. We publish a lot of social theory. We're looking for bold intellectual scholarship. We're very heavily invested still in print. We like to do beautiful books that are beautifully designed. Our brand on the design front is really strong. And we, you see this cover here, that beautiful cover for Birthing Black Mothers, one of our new publications. We embrace and embody equity and inclusion internally and externally with what we publish. We are known for that. We publish the anti-racism toolkits with C4 Disc and SSP and others. Our main mission is to break even. We also believe in open access and are experimenting quite heavily in that. Every book, every author gets the opportunity to publish OA with us, because we really, from an openness and accessibility kind of perspective, that's the only way these books are going to get around the world. We're also publishing open access journals too. And I arrived in June of 2019 and looked at what we were doing with our ebooks, and we have a really great library relations team with Kim Steinley and others, many of you know, and they're really excellent. They have a global reach, and they handle collection sales. But what I noticed was that we didn't have a lot of our channels optimized, especially related to single title. I was at Project Muse when Project Muse put the ebooks on there, and I listened to every librarian that gave me feedback about the things that we needed to do. And I realized that we really need to meet demand wherever it is. There are different, issues and different objectives at different institutions. And we wanted to make sure that we were fully optimized. So we offered our single titles on Project Muse, on JSTOR, and on De Gruyter. And, we have a press of about 100 folks. So it's manageable for us to be able to do this. It's a lot of work, but it's important, I think, to have that coverage, to have, and even a Gobi integration. We did that as well, so that, folks that wanted to go just directly to Gobi to order single titles, they could from us. So we invested a lot of workflows into trying to make our titles available. And we're looking at really building some subject collections in the future in Black studies and LGBTQ and Indigenous studies, based on some feedback in terms of we're able to provide a kind of interesting and dynamic DEI library for libraries. And really, one of our principles too is to align our core values with libraries and make our content discoverable, center equity and inclusion in what we do. We feel like, even with our the librarians at Duke University, that we're very closely aligned with some of the things that they're doing too. And they've published some of our books OA, especially ones related to the campus. And it's just been a nice synergy. But I've always had great relationships with all the libraries that I work with. And I think that's something I've brought to Duke University Press, but it was already there, to be honest. Kim Steinley and her group are fantastic. So here's a look at the most downloaded titles from fiscal year 21, and you see a lot of the things that we do. It's no surprise that Living a Feminist Life, our #1 bestseller for the last 5 years, is #1. Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway. These are all interdisciplinary, really interventions that really push the envelope. So for instance, In the Wake is about, it's about actually the actual wake of Christina, one of Christina Sharp's relatives, the funeral wake, but also the water that's coming off the slave ship. So there's all these different sort of theoretical interventions going on. Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory by Patricia Hill Collins. All the books that you see there in print are classics and bestsellers. And the results of expanding those channels has been really great. And I want to say thank you to everyone on this call who helped make that happen. Our ebook sales are increasing. They are now 35% of our overall books revenue in FY21, and that's up from 25% in 2015. The single title has gone over, has raised by 1 million, and that's put us up over 3 million for just ebooks in general. And we've had over the last, in the last fiscal year, the highest overall revenue performance. And I think some of that speaks to what we're publishing, because it's the titles themselves are grounded in the moment. Many of the issues that are top of mind are coming out with the books that we publish. And I also believe that having any kind of success in publishing overall has to do with really strong relationships. So a couple of charts and graphs to show you. If you look at the middle portion there, you see things, since fiscal year 16, last 5 years, kind of moving in a direction. And I believe that direction, the positive direction it's moving in, is because we weren't necessarily optimized and in all of the different channels that we needed to be in. You can see that library sales piece is growing. Our collection sales in the blue, that's sort of maintained steady. It's been good for people that like that option. It's there and it can be taken advantage of, but really we're seeing the growth is in the single titles. And there again, you can see, pretty stable on the ebook book collections, and then single title sales. We had our best year ever in the history of the press for single title ebook sales in the last fiscal year. And so something I talk about is like, the pie is wanting to make sure that that we have everything covered. If you see some of the channels on the left there, that this is all, you don't want to miss slices of the pie that are out there that you could be getting. And because these are revenues that are very important to university presses. You're looking at the print monograph, you're looking at that kind of model that's broken. And we, on the print side, offer a paperback option for everything we publish, which I think is great. And so there is somewhat of an accessible price on the print side, but this is really important for us to focus on, especially at 35% now of our overall books revenue. And so the previous slide was FY20, and what you see here is now FY21. So you see JSTOR coming into the mix with 20%. That wasn't there in the previous slide. And also some growth with Project Muse single title. One thing that's not on there yet is De Gruyter, but those sales have been good, and we're working to try to get those into the system. So some of the time, our workflows and our systems aren't really able to capture all of that. But just to show you that this is what we're looking at. We're looking at trying to grow that amount so that we can, cover our expenses and break even. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to the Q&A. I think Arielle is, I believe, next.
I am, but my notes are not on this slide deck, so I'm just going to stop sharing for a second and hop over to mine, and then we'll hop back. Sorry about that. Kind of unexpected shifts as we move through this. Thank you for bearing with us with this. I'm hoping that looks okay. Can I get a yes in the chat? Yep, great. Okay. So I am joining you today from the territory of the Silks Okanagan Nation. I just wanted to open up with saying that and mentioning, these are whose lands that I am graciously permitted to live on and work from. And our beautiful campus, which is in the background of this particular slide, is also based on these lands and offers a very rich learning environment for all of our students and faculty and staff. So today I'm going to explore and discuss what UBC has seen play out over the last 12 months as we settled into our new normal and showcase some of the bridging points to what we're seeing from last year. So looking back to our presentation last year, UBC's focus during the first year of the pandemic was to address whether or not our library had really been ready for the move to online learning and research, minimal and at times closed off access to our print collections, as well as taking a deeper look at our own ebook acquisitions practices. So we considered it all. We had evidence-based acquisition models and package purchases. We had our title by title selection approaches, temporary access collections offered by a multitude of publishers, university presses, as well as HathiTrust, and as well as the impact that electronic had on many of the unique acquisitions needs at our institution around non-English language titles, as well as Canadian university press titles. And all of this is probably not new to any of you either. Many of you will have experienced the same. So the result of all this, we knew that there was kind of no going back from that, and that ebooks would become more of a priority than they had already been for us. But of course, that really meant a continued learning about the long-term needs and wants of our users, as well as what publishers would be willing to do post-pandemic for their customers. So that's what I'm going to touch on today. So we are seeing a multitude of multilingual packages kind of hit the market, which is fantastic as our institution has a lot of high non-English language research and teaching needs. But with this come some challenges, and especially with some instances of very poor metadata practices. And for this, some publishers are selling titles, but not backing it up with discoverability and access needs for the content. And similar to selling print, they think handing over the content is enough, and that we will kind of always do that custom cataloging. And in some cases, they want to sell us front lists without any impending publication kind of title lists available, which for us is really an important draw for packages. So more work really needs to be done to make this move to ebooks a holistic practice. Knowing all the pieces that make up selling a book is useful and meaningful to a library, including the marketing and discoverability. And so we really want, publishers to take that away from our experience. We're also seeing more direct publisher agreements. So this included new evidence-based acquisition models with publishers where we were a first-time customer. And that was certainly daunting at times. And some imprints, just weren't showing records. We had a lot of challenges with certain pieces of it when we were the first customer, and we kind of had to work through that with them. As well as knowing the renewal of certain resources that were acquired with the intention of being one-time funding during COVID. So we were able to see kind of a shift in our usage, our requests, and our funding sort of aligned to be able to keep some of those COVID time resources. Additionally, some of our faculty are also making the shift themselves. So they're prioritizing open access publishing initiatives and sort of leading the way in doing it themselves. They know that they want their work open, and they aren't going to wait for a publisher to fill that need in their discipline. And this is prompting conversations around criteria for tenure and promotion, which I know was mentioned in the keynote this morning, breaking down stigmas around open access, as well as promoting greater flexibility in what is being produced and released into the world. And anecdotally from these initiatives, we're also being asked a lot of questions about discoverability and metadata, and how best to get their content into the library systems and discoverable. So it's very clearly a wider need from the non-English language publishers, some of them that we've been working with, all the way down to some of the individual faculty members that are releasing their own content. This is a need overall. Next, kind of looking at the user needs around some of this that we were seeing this past year. Firstly, hybrid teaching, learning, and research really came to the forefront. And with the move to return to campus, we also saw, more classes were returning to being online, but many were still using that hybrid model. So this meant constantly being on our toes when it came to electronic offerings and continuing to prioritize ebooks for use in student research. So as many chose to remain off campus or at a distance and unable to pick up print loan requests, many of our students were still attending sometimes in-person classes, but from another country. Additionally, there were a lot of faculty hiring sprints and cluster hires. So there were new programs starting, as well as a greater investment in EDI initiatives. So for example, many universities are seeing Black faculty cluster hires. At UBC specifically, we're seeing hiring sprints to bring on more Indigenous faculty members across all of our programs. So this means that there are many new research and teaching needs that need to be addressed in our collections. And the university presses offer a lot of this content, I know, as Dean was just mentioning, and we're glad to be able to support these new hires with existing resources, as well as investing in more press content and packages and initiatives, as well as open access ones, so such as the MIT and University of Michigan open access models. Thirdly, format and publisher preferences. So many of our users prefer university press content for research purposes. While we have seen declining print circulation, much of what the university presses publish is still actively sought out and requested directly of us. So specifically, the university press content is what the faculty turn to much of the time to populate their own personal libraries. And from what Dean was saying, with title by title purchases, and as well as through Amazon, I'm not entirely surprised by this. So we certainly need to meet them where their desired need is. You know, if they're collecting it for themselves, that's what they're going to be using in their classes. And in return, that's what the students are going to be asking us to have in our library so that they can access that content as well. Fourthly, looking at e-textbooks over the last year, there's certainly an increased desire for libraries to support e-textbooks in some way across Canada. And this is nothing new in the US either. But it isn't simple, and it doesn't appear to have the right conversations taking place. So I'm currently running a small pilot to investigate which publishers are willing to work with libraries. And so far, I've found that most are still unwilling to work with us and will only really work through third-party product vendors such as VitalSource or directly with bookstores, which, of course, with VitalSource, we're not going to manage, but I do know some libraries have taken that on. Additionally, more work needs to be done to address the financial burden on students. The pandemic really should have been a good time to start to have this conversation, but things are certainly falling short in my eyes. And maybe the answer comes back to the, looking at the general ebooks and using those as course materials instead. And this would really ensure that libraries can better support the students who we are primarily responsible for supporting in a lot of our work. And finally, trade publications. So we receive many course requests and personal requests for trade publications, as it is very common for them to cover EDI and current event topics of interest. But most publishers don't actually sell them in Canada to academic libraries as ebooks, only public libraries. So there are certain talks to fix this, specifically around the Penguin Random House titles, but it constantly stalls and the solution never seems to be in sight, even though there's lots of promises made. So, hopefully this can kind of grow in the future, but we're not really holding our breath on that one. Sort of lastly in this conversation were the financial considerations over the last year. So firstly, around renewals. So some renewals for packages and EBAs are still coming in flat, which is hugely appreciated as we are still not through this pandemic. And, the shifting needs of hybrid teaching isn't really fully understood. So understanding that this isn't our forever, but it is still, a huge way that publishers can build trust and relationships with libraries by negotiating fairly. There are some publishers, though, not any university presses that we've seen, that are trying to recoup what they did not receive last year by jumping to 4% or more this year with increases on ebook packages. And usually they're still open to negotiation, but they're not really leading with that. So it's really flagging it as a concerning practice that if it's taking hold, there needs to be open conversations about why they're doing this and what their needs are. And it just doesn't really seem to be aligning in our negotiations. Additionally, relicensing. So there was a relicensing of serials that took place for institutions across Canada earlier this year, which did allow some breathing room at fiscal year end for us in March 2021, where we could address a desiderata and urgent one-time needs for ebook backfiles and other resources. But our budget is still pretty much status quo, especially in other institutions across Canada, or it's decreasing. So this sort of one-time option of a bailout just isn't a huge help in the long run, and it's more of a band-aid. So while financial considerations can be argued for any and all library resources, as we sort of see a decline in monograph use overall, this is concerning for what it means to acquire ebooks going forward. So really asking ourselves then, and my question kind of for 2021 going into this was, how can we balance listening to our users as well as trying new things? So as classrooms continue to evolve into hybrid learning environments and the offerings from publishers on the market is more than any one budget can assume, it is important to invest in what our users are asking for and being asked to use in their courses in particular, in support of growing EDI initiatives, and of course, in initiatives that align with the values and ethics of the institution and librarianship, such as open access and new models of publishing. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Rob.
Thank you for giving me the chance to speak. I'll just move to the next slide. I'm at the University of Calgary, 30,000 FTE. Next slide. And so I'm just picking up from where I talked at our presentation last year. I mean, before the pandemic, we had exchange rate woes. 2015 was a very bad year for the Canadian dollar. It lost 23% against the US dollar. And that caused a lot of headaches for us because we spend a lot of our collections purchases are in US dollars. Our budget couldn't keep with rising costs. It never seemed to cover the cost of our inflation. There was a gradual cannibalization of the book budget to support the big serial packages. So, Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, all those kinds of people. And we were e-preferred, but that seemed to be more policy than practice. Even though we were saying we were e-preferred, we still ended up buying a lot of print books, and that ranged anything from the ebook not being available in Canada to pricing to delays where the print would come out right away and the approval plan would pick that up and the ebook might come out 2, 3, 4 months later. Next slide. But we've had some good news, and I'll start with the first thing is, of course, the exchange rate. In 2020, the average over the entire year was one Canadian dollar would buy 74.5 cents US. This year, averaging out monthly exchange rates, our exchange rate was 80.6 cents. And I checked earlier this week, the exchange rate for that day was 81 cents. So that's very exciting for us. It means our budget we have more bang for a buck. And we're hoping that'll hold for all of November and December and January, because some of our biggest annual purchases often happen in those 3 months. And 85% of our expenditures are in US dollars. So that's a big deal. Next slide. And you can see our trend in book buying was gradually going down, followed by the last fiscal year, which was most of the first year of the pandemic. We essentially doubled our book buying. And so I'll talk a bit more about that. You'll see that the print is still declining, but we have this huge sudden expenditure in ebook packages, and I'll explain why in the next slide. And I'm going to talk a bit about Canadian universities seem to have survived the first year of the pandemic. The majority of them in good financial shape. And the first reason for that, my first 3 bullets here are taken from Alex Usher. He's a Canadian higher education consultant who does a lot of writing and speaking in higher ed in Canada. And what happened was that Canadian universities were expecting their enrollments to plummet. They were expecting domestic students would just take a year off and come back the next year. International students, because of travel restrictions, might not even come. And because we're very driven on revenue from tuition, we were expecting financial losses. So universities started slashing costs wherever they thought they could. And then enrollment held. And to the shock of everyone, a large number of Canadian universities actually had budget surpluses for the first year of the pandemic. Now, I will point out the University of Calgary wasn't one of those universities. We actually had a loss, but even we lost much less money than we expected. And so that was a big deal. And who knew that you could save all this money by closing campus and pushing everything online? And it's not that it's not necessarily that everyone enjoyed having online versus face-to-face courses, but the first year of the pandemic, people were in fairly good shape. And what happened at the University of Calgary, of course, just because the university is saving money doesn't mean that'll end up in the library's budget. But at U of C, the last third quarter of the fiscal year, for much of the fiscal year, we were walking on pins and needles, worried that we would be forced to have a mid-year budget cut. All of a sudden, instead of not getting our budget cut, towards the end of the year, one-time money kept being made available to us. And so we spent that money on ebook packages, evidence-based acquisitions. So it was from a financial point of view, the pandemic was a surprisingly good year for us. Next slide. So I'm just going to briefly reiterate what happened to us last year during the pandemic. Our main library was closed. Our main library reopened just to students, faculty, and staff. The branch libraries were all closed. For the fall semester, 20% of our courses were face-to-face, but that doesn't mean 20% of students. The big courses were all online. Only small enrollment courses were face-to-face. The second wave of the pandemic hit Canada, and Alberta didn't fare very well. So we had less face-to-face during the winter semester. I don't have exact stats. There were no print reserves, which really impacted some faculty because they were expecting that print book that we didn't have as available as an ebook. Our plan was not to buy any print books for the fiscal year, for that academic year. We kept getting pushback from law, history, political science, foreign languages. So we made more and more exceptions. But even so, our print spending still fell. Next slide. This year, campus is all of a sudden, there are people back on campus. 86% of our students are either attending all face-to-face courses or attending hybrid courses. And what we mean by that is they might have 2 face-to-face courses on campus and 1 hybrid course. And that is actually putting heavy pressure on the library in a different kind of way, because all of a sudden students, so let's say that you're on campus for your face-to-face course, and then the next hour you have to find a quiet spot to settle in and watch your online course online. And so there's a huge pressure for the library and all of campus to provide quiet spaces where students can retreat and take their online course before their next face-to-face course shows up. 14% of our students are still online. The majority of faculty and staff are back on campus, though we still see people who aren't around because of they've gotten different kinds of exemptions to work off campus. Because of restrictions, very few non-university folks are allowed to come on campus. In the library, we're restricting to just students, faculty, and staff. Some of our branches are open. We are seeing an uptick in print reserves because we're discouraging them, but not forbidding them. And so a lot of faculty are putting material on reserve in the library. So we're seeing a lot of print reserve use. Next slide. So I guess where are we at? Digital is still heavily preferred. And that's we are moving in that direction, but not quite as much as we'd like. In 2019, just before the pandemic, we changed our policies. We used to buy the textbooks for all the courses and put them on reserve. And we decided that that was not a good use of our collection money. So we stopped doing that. And as the pandemic went into place, we got more and more pressure to buy textbooks, and not just print, of course, e-textbooks. And we've mostly resisted that. Of course, part of the issue is that they're so much more expensive. Also have a lot more pressure to buy streaming video. In that case, of course, we have been buying a lot more streaming video. Our approval plans are turned back on. We've rewritten them a little bit to discourage print. We're waiting longer for the giving the ebooks more time to arrive before we'll settle for a print book. More invested in ebooks and EBA packages. Firm ordering is back. And then the last slide, I guess for my part. I guess where are we at? I mean, for most of last fiscal year, we were expecting mid-year budget cuts. But then, of course, we didn't have any cuts, and we got more money at the year that we could spend on one-time purchases. So we're wondering what's going to happen with our EBAs. Will we be able to renew some or all of them? Will we have to walk away from them at the end of this year? We live in an environment where our provincial government has been looking at slashing government expenditures, not on higher education specifically, but everywhere. And they've been forced to stop or slow down on that because of the pandemic. As the pandemic comes out, will that start happening more and more again? So we're wondering how that's going to affect our budget. And so, I mean, we're surprised that we've ridden out the pandemic as well as we have, but we're still worried about where this leaves us going forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Well, I'm going to try and adhere to our 10-minute limits as well as my three colleagues here. Great job, everyone. My perspective is going to be largely, again, as Dean's was, the publisher perspective, but there's a little bit of something here for everyone, I hope. One of the great Italian, giving away my background, Canadian books is Never Cry Wolf. And another book by the same author, Farley Moat, is The Boat Who Wouldn't Float. Highly recommended. But I'd like to talk about The Boat Who Wouldn't Float as a kind of parable for the times we live in. So Arielle, can I get to our next slide, please? So the next slides I'm going to show, I've shown before. Please bear with me, they keep changing. It's been fascinating to me to watch the disembodiment of the book, which was always an object, whether stone or paper. I always thought it would be fascinating to live, you know, between 1450 and the early 1500s to see the movable type press come into existence. But this has been something different. The object for the first time has been disembodied. It's served and consumed differently. And that's interesting. I'd like to take a minute to run through that. By the way, the quote here from Dante is timely, I think, for the autumn. He has the image of souls falling to the river Acheron in the fall, like autumn leaves. And every time I see autumn leaves fall, I think of that passage. But anyway, it's not that we're going to hell, but these certainly are turbulent times. Next slide, Arielle. So here's a real short abbreviated timeline, but World Wide Web appears 1993, 1994, Netscape, you may remember that, 1995, eBay, Amazon appear, 1998, Google, 1999, I call out Napster because they had that use-based model and sharing that's really come to occupy such an important place in publishing and libraries these days, as well as eBury and NetLibrary. And they represented a new sector that wasn't in the market before, the ebook aggregator. That was important. I spent a few years at eBury and it was wonderful. Great time. That was pre-ProQuest. 2002 to 2005, there's some variation in there about when it started, but Google Books appears. 2004, ebooks.com in Australia created EBL, another academic ebook aggregator, along with Kutzmeier Library. And EBL importantly created PDA or DDA, as well as short-term loan, which were part of that disembodiment of the book. 2007, the Kindle, and just 10 years ago, ProQuest and EBSCO, kind of the big electronic information companies, entered the book world. And this year, of course, Clarivate has acquired ProQuest or will acquire ProQuest, which is big data entering the book world in a big way. And this has serious implications, I think, for all of us. Next slide, please. So now a little detail around this, but looking at the consolidation and the birth of new entities, we have eBury and NetLibrary appear in 1999. Baker and Taylor, a large book wholesaler, buying a print book vendor to academic libraries, YBP. You start to see bankruptcies appear, NetLibrary bankrupt, Faxon bankrupt. And then 2004, again, EBL and My iLibrary. Next slide. And here, I'll call out at the top of this slide, Francisco Partners, who acquired Ex Libris and Endeavor, which turn out to be important because they're part of the ProQuest world now, which has also acquired Innovative Interfaces and now is owned by Clarivate. So we're seeing the whole catalog world folded into this, which is interesting. 2009, ebooks were integrated into traditional approval plans. Well, that was treating the ebook as just another format of the print book, but that didn't last long. And also YBP acquired Blackwell. So again, more consolidation, and that was, YBP was owned by Baker and Taylor. EBSCO acquired NetLibrary and ProQuest acquired eBury. So there are the big electronic information companies buying the first book vendors. Next slide, please. And we see the University Press platforms appearing, JSTOR, and just before that was Project Muse. Here we see ProQuest acquiring EBL. We see Blackwell in the UK withdrawing from the academic library supply market. We see EBSCO acquiring YBP in 2015, and then ProQuest acquiring Coutts My iLibrary and Ex Libris. JSTOR launches EBA. That's important too, because we're getting into these new models that, again, can happen because there is online technology and could never have been part of the print object world. So the book really is being disembodied and consumed in different ways, which has huge implications for publishers and the challenges they face. Next slide. And we've seen, again, continuing either bankruptcies, foreclosures. Kentucky was threatened with it. University of Press of New England did close. Wilfrid Laurier was in there somewhere as well, threatened with closure. In 2019, Stanford University Press famously was threatened with closure and didn't. 2019, we saw ProQuest acquire Innovative Interfaces, so adding another library catalog system to Ex Libris and Endeavor, which should give ProQuest, I think, something like 95% of the electronic catalog market in academic libraries in North America. 2020, we all know what happened. COVID came, and if it didn't shut down organizations, it forced us all to work very differently, and for libraries to make the content available online. I'll add that it made publishers scramble to make content available online as well, and some were in better position than others. And finally, 2021, besides the Random House, Simon & Schuster thing, the big deal that excites me and I'm watching is Clarivate, big data acquiring ProQuest. And with all those catalogs and discovery layers and ebook platforms, the thought of the kinds of data that can be plugged in all across the information landscape is very exciting and should be transformational. Next slide. And this is, I try to digest all that into the big concepts. What happened? Pre-2000, we had print wholesalers like Baker and Taylor and Ingram, who sold books to library vendors, who sold the books to academic libraries. Publishers were very far removed from libraries by that point. 1999 through 2006, we saw the print wholesalers acquire the library vendors, so more consolidation in the market and sell to academic libraries. At the same time, the ebook aggregators, a new entry into our world, appeared and publisher platforms, and they sold separately to academic libraries. And then you began to see the bankruptcies with serials and journals vendors, Sweats, Faxon, et cetera. 2007 through 2013, we saw the library book vendors and ebook vendors integrate and sell to academic libraries. And at the same time, digital companies like ProQuest and EBSCO began to acquire the ebook vendors and either sell directly to libraries or to work with the library book vendors and sell to academic libraries. At the same time, though, new models like DDA, short-term loans, started to appear and disrupt the staid book vending to library landscape. 2015, we saw the digital content companies, ProQuest, EBSCO, acquire library book vendors. And now in 2021, we're seeing big data information companies consolidate. So in 3 bullets, information technology companies replace product distribution companies. So use data, discovery services, library automation systems. Libraries evolve from book barns to content delivery vessels. And 3, content selection and delivery processes increasingly and fundamentally are automated. This is important for publishers to understand because if they have the concept that librarians are sitting around looking through book catalogs and choosing which ones to order, those days are long gone. Their books need to flow in an automated, efficient way to libraries and economical. Next slide. So in practical terms, what has change meant? Enter the matrix. Next slide. So libraries have had to reevaluate, as my colleagues have already presented, their collecting strategies. And working for De Gruyter, one of my responsibilities, besides working with publishers, is sales in Canada, which has been, I love that. I've done it in past jobs. And it's been interesting to watch. First of all, we've seen a reevaluation of pre-existing strategies. And I think it was Arielle who wrote this. I think I'm quoting you from a forthcoming paper. As far back as 2013, we had been calling ourselves e-preferred, but when COVID struck, we were forced to reconsider whether that was true. Our policies said we were, but were we walking the talk? In my sales role, and some librarians from this library are actually on the call, in March 2020, we were talking about university press collecting. And we've had a great dialogue, very creative, lots of back and forth, and always figuring a way forward. But they sent me this email. We appreciated the access to the content, but cannot justify spending so much on collections. We must be blunt and say that currently that's just not going to happen. An EBA model would be perfect. Of course, for the type of content we're delivering through these university press models, we can't do that. And it's not part of our agreements with the publishers. But we did provide access to a lot of content because of COVID. So the library got a lot of usage data and wrote in January this year, we have good news to share. We would like to proceed with the offer and purchase the following collections. And there were 4 university press library collections acquired for 5 years into the future. So what I would say about that is that the COVID crisis has increased nuance and flexibility in the use of models. Libraries look at the content that they're using and saying, okay, maybe EBA is our preferred model, but for these 5 presses, there's a better way for us to do this. And finally, from a librarian in Germany, I got this. There's a new imperative for faculty to accept and embrace ebooks and other electronic resources. And I've heard that across Canada as well. There are certain disciplines in particular, like classics, where print books were always preferred, but they weren't accessible anymore. Next slide, please. I think it's important for publishers to understand just how automated the systems are and how much complexity there is, and that libraries just don't have the staff resources, never mind other resources, to go through every book. And just thinking about the appropriate form of content discovery, multiple supplier integration, multiple formats and model integrations, duplication control, MARC records, order records, discovery records, invoice management, physical processing for print, and the need for an online management system. Books need to flow seamlessly through the systems that libraries use. It's an important consideration for publishers. Next slide. And this is just to highlight that, how does a publisher's books appear in the vendor interfaces that libraries are using? Often there are 4 models available on one platform, then there are multiple platforms. So for the 70,000 English language books that a library might need to consider on its approval plans, there may be 14 varieties or flavors of that book. The publisher needs to be aware of what are those models, what are those platforms, and are we there, and are we there in the right way? Next slide. Another thing I think that's not always clear to publishers based on my conversations is the difference between access models and purchase models. DDA gets bandied around together with DRM free all in one basket. If you start to define this, it's important to understand their access models. So is it a 1-user access, a 3-user access, a DRM-free access? And how is the library purchasing those? Are they using a DDA or an EBA plan, et cetera, or an approval plan? So the purchase models and access models are different, and publishers need to think about each carefully. Next slide. So as publishers reevaluate goals, strategies, and values, these are some of the key points. What are their business challenges and the challenge of sustainability? They have to market balance their challenges and goals with the market requirements and environment, challenging library budgets, which we've heard a lot about, the array of vendor and model preferences in the market, which are in flux. So you need to stay up with it. Industry trends and technology trends, mergers and acquisitions, as we've seen, and the competition that's happening right now between vendors. And so their goals will not be the same as publishers. And I don't think that was quite true in the print world, but it is now. So publishers need to keep that in mind. And finally, press values, which Dean talked about beautifully, reaching as wide an audience as possible. We don't want to eat those books or keep them in our warehouse. Equity, fairness, inclusion, and of course, the main goal of university presses is the outstanding support of scholarship. Next slide. So summing up, we've definitely reached a tipping point from print to ebooks in the academic environment. Our retail is completely different. Publishers are reevaluating digital policies and strategy. They must. The idea of a level playing field is quaint. That was true in the print world. The book is 1995. But now with all these different electronic vendors whose models are all different, even when they have the same name, they work differently. If you take a JSTOR DDA and an EBSCO DDA, same name, but they work differently, the triggers. So you have to have, as a publisher, a more nuanced and complex view of what these are and how you choose to participate, because they're impacting each other. So hard decisions need to be made regarding partners and models based on comprehensive data, not just what you're told. Library focus is on digital content availability, access, and delivery. You need an accurate understanding of nuance in library collecting strategies. And Librarian in the UK has sent us this. The crisis has pushed forward elements of library automation and remote working that should have happened years ago. So for a publisher, my advice is to build a systematic approach that you can repeat and use repeatedly to evaluate your results in your distribution of content to libraries. The only constant is change, so build a boat that will float. And last slide, Arielle. And there's Farley Mowatt again. Read that book, you'll enjoy it. Thank you.
Okay, we're in a little bit of a different situation with this session because it's set up like a meeting. So everybody can see everybody in Zoom, and there's over 200 of us in here. So I'm not sure if Beth is able to maybe pop some of the questions that are showing up in Pathable in the Zoom chat, and when we can go through those and certainly answer them. I know there's been a few throughout.
Well, I'm hoping I can read them to you. Would that work, Arielle?
Absolutely. And we'll want to go to the folks that are live in the room as well. They have a mic and they're able to ask questions as well.
Sure. I know there was a question about print reserves, I believe, maybe for Rob, back a long time ago. And the individual asked whether those print reserves were actually used by the students.
I know there's some use, but that's actually a good question. In the middle of the semester, I haven't tried to study how much use they're getting. I know there's some use and that students are using our print reserves. But how effectively or often, I don't know. But 86% of students are coming to campus, so there's some use there.
And there was also a question about how much money is allocated to EBA this year.
I'm going to say in excess of $1 million Canadian. So $1 million Canadian at current exchange rate would be roughly 810,000 US.
Okay, and there was a question on plans on how to fund the renewals, and we would all like to know the answer to that question.
That's all in process.
Then, Arielle, there's a question for you about elaborating on multilingual packages. Any Spanish ebooks from the Caribbean and Latin American countries included?
A great question. Predominantly, that hasn't been our focus. Our focus has mostly been around French language as well as Asian language materials. So my point of view is mostly coming from those language areas, but of course, this affects a multitude of languages around the world and how things get published, and certainly Spanish language ebooks wouldn't be included in that.
Let's see, I'm not quite to the bottom of the chat yet, but everyone is very excited about the slides and they're grateful for the presenters for those. And all right, let's see, Michael. In most cases, we cannot interlibrary loan our ebooks because of restricted licenses. Would publishers reconsider the model of ebooks for benefits of education?
Yeah, that's one I don't have a good answer for. I know it's being experimented with. It's being experimented for in particular by individual publishers on their own platforms. For example, Springer has done it. But for a third-party vendor, it's difficult because, as with a short-term loan, what publishers see is a loss of revenue without any compensation for it. So I think that will come. I just don't think there's like textbooks right now, there's just not a great model for it. So that's for the future. It's not ill will on anyone's part. It's just as library budgets are strapped, publishers, especially we're talking about university presses here, so not for profits, they're strapped as well. They're part of the universities. So I wish I had a better answer.
All right, for Arielle or perhaps any of the panelists, we too are having issues with trade publishers not allowing for most ebook sales, but increasingly more and more titles in my particular collecting subjects are published by those trade publishers. What could be possible solutions or workarounds for academic libraries?
Thank you for that question. I see it, Shauna. I fear that the moment that they are made available, the only model will be single user. And, you know, it's better than nothing. But I will say, I don't think that the trade publishers have still quite comprehended the impact that their content actually has on the post-secondary sphere. And I think that maybe we need to be having more frank conversations directly with them, rather than through some of these third-party vendors that they're working with, such as Overdrive and others, right? So I don't necessarily have a direct answer for you, but I think, you know, the more that all of us can be speaking to them and voicing our concerns, like I know there is an offer on the table to, at least in Canada, to have ProQuest bring some of these through. And there was an accidental leak of that content about 1.5 years ago where some titles became available and then they pulled them back. So I think we've all gotten a taste of what that can look like, and more conversations can hopefully help to bridge what our needs are around that. But I still have some skepticism around that.
Thank you. We do have a couple more questions in the chat, but I did want to see if there was anyone in the room who wanted to ask questions as well. I'll let people make their way to the mic and ask you, Robert and Arielle, one more question. I'm wondering if prospective shared print collaborative collection development is a part of your considerations of how to handle print acquisitions in an increasingly e-preferred environment. It would also be interesting to hear from the publisher perspective on how collaboration around print book acquisition may or may not impact their sustainability.
Well, at the University of Calgary, we are part of a couple of shared print agreements where we've agreed not to discard anything in certain areas. We've agreed to retain print. Maybe we should be doing that moving forward as opposed to just retrospectively. It's something we should be thinking about more.
I would echo that it's very much old content, not new content, and maybe shifting that to our acquisitions approaches rather than just, preservation conversations. But I'd be interested to know from Dean's perspective on how something like that might affect a publisher.
Yeah, so are you talking about shared print collections? Is that the idea? So that, like, say, Duke would be sharing with UNC in terms of the print, their holdings or something like that?
I think they mean more like one copy would get bought maybe for the state and it would move on like an interlibrary loan.
So we've been seeing the print copies in general, the ones that libraries purchase going down over time. I mean, that was on average, I think even since I've gotten there, that's dropped down to 30 per title. So it's not necessarily, I would be open to trying different new things. I mean, that would be certainly, especially as we move more toward ebook sales and more toward ebook collections, the individuals are for the most part buying our print copies. So in paper. So that would be, I'd be interested in at least talking about it, certainly.
Can I jump in with a comment here too, that is happening in some places. For example, the Marley Consortium, the Manhattan Research Library Initiative, have deals with a number of publishers where they have a consortial agreement for the ebooks, and then I believe it's the New York Public Library Research Division is holding one copy of every print book. I think the Research Triangle has had similar agreements with, for example, UPSO, Oxford's UPSO. And I know OhioLink has been coordinating the number of print copies from some publishers. So to a limited degree, I think that has happened. I don't know how extensible it is.
This is a great conversation, and there are in fact more questions, but we are at time. So I just want to check with our panelists to see what you would like to do.
I see there's actually a lot of questions in the chat. Mm-hmm. Perhaps I will say, if you don't mind popping your questions that have been unanswered in the Pathable chat, we can certainly go back to that session page and answer them there for you as well.
I see a question from Joshua Lupkin, and it's just one that happened today. De Gruyter has signed an author for a book at University of Oregon, and part of our agreement with him is to make that ebook, first of all, the preprint, and then eventually the ebook when it's out available to the University of Oregon, free of charge, of course. So.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I see some people are hopping off the session. And again, please pop your question in the chat in the Pathable session piece of it, and we're happy to continue the conversation.